Happy Tuesday. Thanks so much for joining us and David Bowie today. My name is Will Follett. I'm the senior producer here at BizNow, and thank you all so much for joining us for today's conversation, talking about modernizing the office of the CFO, automating operations across performance, visibility, and control across pretty much all systems in the executive suite. Today's webinar is brought to us by Agora, good friends of ours and partners on this conversation. We've got a lot of really interesting things to talk about today, and we're really excited about it. As we think about the things we see here at BizNow across AI, automation, economic headwinds, personnel changes, and the ways those define operational success for commercial real estate companies, how and where the C-suite leaders work to stay ahead of that curve can often be the difference between closing a deal, assessing an asset, or keeping the wheels sort of spinning at the organization. And wanted to unpack a lot of what those decisions look like behind the scenes and take us kind of inside of some of the minds of the industry's leading experts in the real estate, risk management, finance, operations sphere. It should be a fantastic conversation. Before we start, a couple quick notes for everybody. We've got folks watching us from all over the world today, so thank you all for taking the time to join us. Feel free to say hello in the chat. Let us know where you're tuning in from. We also have a Q&A section that you are welcome to submit questions through. Time allowing, we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. If it's germane, I'll aim to work it into the conversation live, and if not, we'll work it in wherever we can throughout the conversation as it follows. And if you missed any of the panel, don't worry. The replay is available to everyone who registered. We'll email it to you after, and you can watch it anytime at biznow.com/webinars. As mentioned, we have a fantastic lineup today, and I want to give the panelists a chance to introduce themselves and share a little bit more about what they do. Eloise Shears, the Chief Risk Officer at Foreman Capital, Josh Israel, the CFO at the Davis Companies, and Amy Hall, the COO of Caton Commercial, folks who are really providing a lot of the great work that we see often behind the scenes of the folks that we put on our stages, making sure that the deal is closed, that the diligence is done, that the risk is assessed for, and that the trains run on time for a lot of these different types of firms, whether it's operational, developers, capital, wherever it is. It should be a really interesting conversation to hear from them as we delve deeper, but I'd like to give them all a chance to introduce themselves now. So Eloise, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Will. I'm Eloise Shearers, as Will said, and I'm the Chief Risk Officer for Foreman Capital, not the CFO, but this is, I think, one of the things we will talk about today. Um, we are a small private equity company. If I say small, I guess, depends on what you regard small. Our assets under management varies between, 500 million to about 1 billion on a good day. And we then put out our capital in terms of private lending on commercial real estate transactions, also doing a lot of construction lending, very admin heavy because of that. And even though I am the Chief Risk Officer, I sit on credit, I oversee our assets under management. We also do our own internal servicing of all of our deals and loans. But like most of the people on the panel today, I get to wear many different hats. And as much as I love real estate, which is my passion, most of my day I end up talking about other things than the real estate. And it often, relates to operations, the risk, integration. And I love the word automation, but, we're striving to get to automation, but still very much dependent on human input. So I'm sure we'll talk about that a little later on. Thank you for having me, Will.
Yeah, fantastic. It's a pleasure. Josh, why don't you go next?
I'm Josh Israel. I'm the CFO at Davis. We are a multi-strategy private equity real estate company. I like Eloise's range of AUM, so I'm going to use that myself. We range from 4 to 5 billion. We invest through closed-end, value-added, opportunistic funds. I'm responsible here for all of the financial and accounting and risk management responsibilities. Risk management, though, focused on insurance. It can also include compliance. I'm involved in compliance, but we have a separate chief compliance officer. And I've been at the firm for going on 10 years now.
Fantastic. And Amy, what about you?
Good morning, Will. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Amy Hall with over the last 7+ years, I have served as the Chief Operating Officer for Caton Commercial, and we operate across brokerage, property management, and valuation, roughly transaction volume anywhere between 160 million to $300 million a year. My role really has always straddled the intersection of finance, operations, and compliance. So similar to my counterparts here, I wear a lot of hats and real estate. This is my 30th year in the real estate industry. And while it is definitely my passion, the majority of my day is spent around finances, risk management, and the operations side of the business.
Fantastic. Well, thanks all for being here. And let's go ahead and get started with, I think, an interesting focus of the conversation. We talked a little bit about how the office of the CFO, right, the sort of esoteric thing, is expanding well beyond accounting and reporting and into a lot of the work around operations and things like that. And I'd like to start, I think, by talking a little bit more about how you guys think about redefining that function and a little bit more into the support strategy, risk management, things like that. How do you, and I guess Josh, we'll start with you on this. How do you sort of keep the balance, right, of making sure accounting, tax, finance, operations sit within that broader mandate while also making sure that there's allowing roles for operations and sort of, the broader kind of investment and support strategy there?
Yeah, I think that, the accounting, tax, and risk management components of our business is growing more complex and needs, and as a result of that, we've been working towards, trying to integrate, our responsibilities into the more of the investment making decisions. For example, while federal tax law has become a bit more streamlined over the last couple of years, state tax law has become a lot more complex. And I think you're seeing a lot of states be impacted by federal policies and as a result, looking to capture more revenue. So one area that we've been focusing on is getting more involved up front with our investment teams and looking at investments from a tax perspective, how they impact our funds. When we look at what states they're located in, and how that can sometimes drive or change, the sort of the targeted return that we're seeking for an investment in a particular state, taking into consideration state tax laws. That's one way that I think, the sort of the face of, the operations is changing. Another way is, in risk management, when we think about insurance has become over the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years, it's really become a growing part of, especially the last five, I'd say, growing part of a budget. And so it becomes more, used to be 1 or 2%. Now, depending where you're operating, like New York City, right, if you're developing a property, it could be upwards of 10% of a project budget. So, you've got to get those numbers right up front. And so there's a lot more due diligence that goes into evaluating a project before you're making an investment from my side of the house.
Yeah, absolutely. Amy, I saw you nodding there. Anything you wanted to add?
I agree. I think that really that, and for a smaller organization such as Caton, a lot of times you have consolidation across the roles. So that CFO function, at least for us, has really evolved into a much more integrated role and forward looking when it comes to our operating platform. And like you said, with risk management, I use third party advisors very heavily since there, aren't the internal resources across the individual um, disciplines that normally fall within a CFO purview, that's really important. So that way I can make sure that the operating and the company environment is sound and solving for not only looking at it from a financial perspective, but also the adoption, the execution, and as much as the strategy piece.
Absolutely. And Eloise, what do you any thoughts here as we think about sort of the expanding role, right? How do you make sure that all these things sort of come together and expand where they need to while also, conforming to your idea of risk mitigation and, keeping everybody kind of out of trouble?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we are not going the opposite way, but real estate is really the core of what we know. And I'm speaking about we are four partners, and then obviously some staff. That's at the core of our business, and that's what we focus on. And we know what we know, but we also know what we don't know. Well, we kind of realize there's a lot we don't know. And we have really shifted really in the opposite direction. Instead of trying to do what is not our expertise, we're becoming, from both a risk and operational efficiency and cost efficiency points of view, we are a little bit like Amy referenced, becoming more and more reliant on outsourcing and third parties. Our
Mhm.
CFO function indeed is actually 100% outsourced. Our fund accounting is 100% outsourced. But it's important that you have key personnel, available that can interpret all of that and then also provide the interface to make sure that in the end of the day, our business goals are aligned, but also the risk mitigation, that nothing falls on the ground. We have compliance, outsourced companies that we utilize as well, our audits, all of those things. But in the end of the day, we like to be more integrated. So it's growth, it's efficient for us, it's definitely cost efficient, but the integration sometimes is a little lacking. And when I'm sure later in the conversation we're going to touch on technology, we are trying to, work on trying to have that integration and that interface created by technology, specifically AI also. But again, I can't emphasize the importance of having the right key personnel available in the correct positions for us, knowing what your strengths and your weaknesses are and kind of just to focus on that. But for the most part, for a lot of these functions, we are looking at outsourcing and third party, providers.
Which is interesting in and of itself, right? I think we talked a little bit about this when we talked ahead of time, right? But thinking about how that works, not just from a operational risk perspective, but from sort of a culture perspective, right? Making sure everybody kind of stays aligned with the broader mission of the company and sort of thinking about that. Josh, you mentioned this a little bit when we chatted in anticipation of the conversation, right? Around outsourcing and how you work with some of the accounting teams in places overseas. How do you sort of keep those things aligned there?
Yeah, it's really important when you've got an outsourced provider, to, I think, as you just alluded to make sure they understand your culture. And that's not something that you just flip on with a switch. It takes time, it takes work. And you're not going to be successful if you don't put in that time and that work. And the employees who are sort of on site with you here buy into that strategy, right? Because if there's not buy-in, it's going to fail miserably. I think we talked about we have a small team that we've built over time overseas, to do some accounting functions. The goal is to grow that. But we've been very slow to adopt it because we want it to be successful, right? I think if you run too fast too, you increase the risk of failure. So
Mhm.
we've started building a team, overseas, but making sure that, they're getting the training, and that also goes to creating the right incentives for the people here working with the people overseas, that they understand, the benefits to them as well, right? To working with overseas, or it doesn't matter, they don't have to be overseas, or just, an outsourced solution, right? And that takes time, and patience, and in-person, training to, and in-person connections. So we're very much focused on that here at Davis, and we have a small team in India. We brought them over last year for 2 weeks, and that went such a long way to sort of create that goodwill on both sides of the fence, right? And because you spend a lot of time trying to retain, to building, this team, you want to retain them. So, having that connection, I think hopefully creates, a stronger opportunity for retention as you build this.
Yeah, absolutely. And Amy, how do you think about it, right? You mentioned some of the sort of similar practices, even if it's a different sort of kind of operation, right? How do you think about, the scaling of the culture and making that's somewhat universal, right? Every company has that.
Absolutely. The culture is first. And I think where we differ just a little bit from Davis is that yes, the third party partner has to be brought into the culture, but our primary team has to be prepared and understand the reasoning behind this, integration and adoption of, that modern workforce structure of bringing in someone from the outside to help augment their role, not replace their role, because that's oftentimes where a team gets very nervous is, am I going to be replaced? And it instantly puts up a barrier between the in-house team and the third party team being able to create that real trust between one another. So
Right.
helping your team internally understand the reasoning behind the risk and sometimes and not risk, but understanding that the reasoning, not the risk behind it, but the reasoning behind having that additional support goes a long way to helping coalesce between the two teams in the internal and outer. We have outsourced a lot of our bookkeeping, our comptroller, um, virtual assistants. So it really was important to us for our internal team to understand how that would be really coming into play when it works as a total picture,
Sure.
not just fragmented.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that I think occurred to me on this too, in addition to the outsourcing, is the maintenance of quality and culture across not just outsourcing, but of hybrid work too, and how you guys think about what that looks like when people aren't coming into the office all the time and things like that. And Eloise, maybe this is a question for you and how you think about this, but how do you sort of think about improving decision making, analytics, things like that, as sort of while also maintaining sort of a hybrid workforce, right? You have folks that are kind of all over the place. You've got an outsourced different type of thing. How do you kind of keep that risk level maintained and consistent while also, you've got all these sort of disparate parties operating?
Yeah, and that's actually, it's an interesting statement because at our core, we don't really do hybrid, officing
Interesting.
at all. We are all
Sure.
in person and have been, probably a few days after COVID. We've never really been
Hmm.
remote. We like to be in person. We like the face to face. And, again, to Josh and Amy's point, we really cultivate that culture. We have Zoom today, and I think that as we are doing this webinar today, a few years ago, that was a rare thing, but now that's kind of the norm almost. We do like face-to-face Zoom, whatever we need to make sure that we have plenty of interaction and communication with our outsourced resources. That's one of the things we also are focusing on, as I mentioned previously, was platforms, because something that I think is a pinch point for us is visibility, quick and easy access to data. And it's great to have very, very smart people and resources either internally or outsourced available that has all of this data. But if you don't have access to it or an easy way to read it or present it, I think you are a little hamstring tied. And we've really invested pretty heavily in the last year, I would say to 18 months, on trying to improve that aspect at a D level, at a fund admin level, and even an accounting level, to have more software and platforms available where everybody has the visibility that they need. And I would say to us, it's one of the advantages of outsourcing, and it's looked like as such by our investors. It creates, I think, a level of comfort that they know there's a second pair of eyes, another checks and balances. It's not just, because we manage a lot of funds, that's, investor funds. So I think it creates a level of comfort to know that there are those external resources, there are visibility, and checks and balances in place. So that's something that we will be focusing more and more on.
And it's a good sort of transition, I think, into the next part of the conversation with some folks in the chat have already alluded to, which is the technology investment in sort of the conversation and things of that nature, right? And Josh, I'd love to sort of hear your perspective on this, even if you're not, managing IT directly. Like, how do you think about building a culture and sort of even to some extent investing in technologies that support sort of an evolution of things like this, that where they adopt new tools and workflows and things like that, while also making sure that everybody kind of knows what's going on.
Yeah, it's a challenge. It's as my son likes to say, I'm not gonna lie, Dad. Or he's they're big on saying that now, and it's a challenge. I think that there's been a growth and in a lot of organizations, including ours, and I think some of the bigger ones, or so I would say actually more mid-size firms, where people historically have gone off and sometimes bought software to help them in their job, right? In a silo, without somebody sort of overseeing the sort of broader strategy, right? And so you have a lot of these processes and I'm not even talking about outsourced solutions, right? I'm just talking about internally, right? And so that's always been, that's a challenge that we're working with now and trying to detangle all of that, while at the same time sort of creating a more unified platform that then is easier to share, right, with your third-party providers. And I think it's a work in progress, definitely. But that's like the end state, right? Is you have, a more unified platform that sort of, we sort of track it through the evolution of a deal, right? From cradle to grave. So, an opportunity comes in, it could be debt or equity, right? And, there's a pipeline, and then that gets converted to a deal, and that deal, that investment sort of, now you're living with it, right? And you live with it from the accounting standpoint, the asset management standpoint, and through the disposition, and all of those different people who touch it, from your investments professionals to your accounting professionals to your asset management professionals. They are, trying to integrate the systems that they're using, and then to create the visualization that's that's customized to their job, right? But that the data is all underneath it and accessible, as Eloise was alluding to before. That's the end goal, and then you can utilize different resources in different ways, and they don't always have to be connected in one place.
And I think too, one of the things that the examples I can think of, right, even at a company like ours or others, is just employees just signing up for ChatGPT, right? And just like plugging all this information in there that's proprietary or without even thinking about it, right? And then and then having people like, other people on the risk side, people on the finance side be like, okay, wait a minute, like we should not just go plug in all this proprietary information, even if it helps with your workflow, right? Like there are systems in place on this for a reason. And I think sort of retroactively regulating that, I think has been an interesting thing. We've heard that from a lot of folks as we try to figure out what all this, and we'll get to AI in a sec, but to think about that. Amy, anything to add here on the technology side?
I think that one of the things that myself and the executive team at Caton look at is you're exactly right, particularly when you have a platform that runs across several different business lines. The overhyped part of technology is the one source, right? And that's for at least right now, it's somewhat still a myth that you only have to have one platform that can do everything. So when we're looking at the different types of platforms or technologies to bring in, it's really at the end of the day, ROI depends on adoption. And we have to be able to align our leadership with workflows, regardless of which discipline in the company are being served by this technology. So I think that managing that behavior change, because that's the hardest part of any integration and adoption process, is the key to being able to have, that accountability, the visibility and the predictability to any of these things. So I really think that bringing it back to that side of the decision making is so integral when you're looking at different types of technology that you're wanting to bring in-house, not just the cost perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And Eloise, I'd love to kind of hear from you a little bit on what kind of an integrated platform of this actually looks like today. We mentioned sort of a patchwork of systems. We mentioned sort of there's a lot of kind of idiosyncrasies. Where are you seeing the most success in connecting all these things together? Are there things that you've tried that have worked? Are there things that you've tried that have failed? Like what does it kind of look like for you at the moment, and how'd you get there?
It took us a while to get there, and we're very far from there, I would say. Not just a function of ourselves, but also just technology, right? To Amy's point, I don't believe there's a golden bullet out there, one solution or platform that can do everything. And to Josh's point, just for us, it's the same thing. Once you have a prospect and it becomes a deal, it closes, it becomes the asset under management. Then dollars need to be pushed out. You have fund accounting and admin, and we capitalize our own deals. So you have the whole life cycle of funds, different levels that needs to be managed to the penny, with accountability, with visibility, with risk mitigation, transparency, all of these things. And you have to be, compliant with all of the rules. That's, also there to be observed. So that being said, we spend a lot of time, probably 3 years, sitting on the fence, looking at different platforms available. And then we kind of had to pick our poison. What is we first had to make sure we are comfortable in our own work processes and workflow. And I do think you can't expect a platform or a software to fix a shortfall or a shortcoming in your workflow and your organizational and operations. It's a great tool, but it doesn't fix things necessarily. So we really worked hard at creating protocols and structures and putting all of that in place. And then we went to look for a platform that can support our operations. And if we had to make little changes, like Amy said, change is a really hard thing, especially once you start looking at vertical integration and you now involve different departments that are all, we have to by function separate state from church a little bit. And so you've got to maintain that at the same time. So it was kind of baby steps for us. We now have a good platform that, work with our fund admin and accounting, and we have a good platform that works at the D level. But they are different platforms, and you got to, recognize the weaknesses and the strengths of each of those. And I think for future reference, our hope is, and what we are working on now is that AI technologies and APIs, is putting in the missing piece and the missing link to try and, now push this data that we've captured in a more successful way, hopefully, to automate it to a greater extent and provide integration, between different platforms and different departments.
Yeah, absolutely. Josh, what about you? Are there does that sort of track with your experience? Are there more specific, building blocks you guys have taken to sort of developing it? What does it kind of look like today?
Yeah, no, I think we're kind of in the same boat where, we've got, a few different platforms. We're trying to coalesce around those platforms, right? To have a platform that's more focused for, the accounting folks, and then have a platform that's more focused on the investments. And so we're working through that right now. And then we have a plan to create a data lake, right, where we're extracting data from these different systems, that then hopefully the goal, and what is one of the promises of AI, is that they could then take all of that data and analyze it in ways that we aren't thinking about, right? That we just physically, from the limits of our brain power, cannot do, right? And that is, I think, a goal that we are working to, that seems reasonable. We'll see how successful it is. I mean, there are a lot of promises to AI. I think, I know we're going to touch on that, but one of the interesting things that we're seeing so far is that AI holds all of this promise to be more productive, right? To increase our productivity. But right now, it's actually a bit of a stress on the organization, not just from the viewpoint of retraining people how to use it, right? But also that is part of it, but the time component it takes to train
Sure.
people, right? So the productivity is almost a little bit limited, because the gain is kind of in the future. You have to put in work, and you actually have to maybe hire more people to get to an end state where you are more productive. At least that's what we're finding. We've unleashed a couple of AI tools like ChatGPT and Claude internally, and we're letting different groups create use cases for it, to test it out, to try to find where we think it's going to be helpful to impact productivity in reading loan agreements, for example, in reading legal documents, and giving us answers to a specific question that it can answer much faster than me actually opening up a loan agreement and having to read through the whole thing to find one term, right?
Right.
It's pretty amazing in those, and it holds a lot of promise in for that. But it's like almost in addition to your job today, right? Which the example I just gave is the easy example, right? But the more harder example is like, how do I use it to, model a transaction faster and better, right? Because whatever that output is, you still have to check it, right? And you're still stuck with like a lot of somewhat, hallucinations that you're finding through these experiments, right? Sometimes the answers are completely wrong. It's almost a burden in some ways to
Sure.
organizations today in terms of productivity, but obviously we see, potential, long-term, positive impacts.
It's an interesting thing to think about. I remember one anecdote I heard from a GC, right, was they were using, I think it was ChatGPT, it might have been Claude or another LLM, to model something mathematically, right? And they plugged it in 3 different times, and it gave them 3 different answers to the same question, right? So there is, in that sense, it's a literal like measure twice, cut once thing, right? But in thinking about how it's going to be implemented and how it's going to work. How much of it is us just doing something if we just have to go do it again, and if we just have to go validate and check it, right? What's the point there? Amy, what do you think? Where's this stuff still overhyped? Where does it work for you guys? What do you think?
I think that to Josh's point, making certain that your team is using it properly is absolutely key because
Yeah.
there is this assumptive world out there that AI is not ever wrong. And while people who are looking deeper into it know that that's not the case at all, the general layperson, our employees, even us at times, take for granted the information that's coming out of it. So with the three different business lines, we're looking for ways to be able to extrapolate key data, KPIs, bringing them into one snapshot, having that combined look at our holistic company in the ways that the AI can help us achieve that much easier than just the manualized efforts can do that. We have three distinct platforms that measure each of our business lines. So there's not one integrated tool across our company as a whole. We just partnered with CRE OneSource, and we've got a tremendous asset that is now powering our back office for our brokerage. We work with AppFolio on the property management side, and we have a completely different platform for our valuations. So making sure that whoever is going to be bringing that AI integration into the company, whoever's responsible for that, is taking the care and time to, one, look at it from a holistic perspective and look at it from a risk management and compliance standpoint. Because to your point, Will, just dumping things into OpenAI, you are exposing yourselves to a tremendous amount of liability if you have dumped proprietary or confidential information of a client into an OpenAI system. So it's really important that people understand how and when to bring AI into the equation appropriately and what, at least right now, I mean, abstracting is um, a great function and very easy function. And it's easy to do the checks and balances because it's pulling from, a single document. When you get into formulas and forecasting and, modeling deals, that's a whole different ball of wax.
Yeah, absolutely. I always find it's best when it generates information that I could have generated myself. It just does it shorter that I can independently verify, as opposed to say like, go find me this thing and present it to me as fact. That to me that's, and maybe we'll get there. Maybe at some point it'll get there. But that's how I think about it. And I think the work I do is a little bit, obviously the work we do is a little bit different, and the stakes are a little bit different from the real estate side of things. But it's still the concept is the same, and I think a lot of people think about it that way too. Eloise, what do you think about this from a risk perspective, right? As we bring in AI and these new technologies, how do you think about that in the context of not just the platforms you have in place, but just sort of as you think about, how and where people should be thinking about investing and spending time and in some cases money in LLMs or things like that?
Um, it depends on what your, I think, objective is at the end of the day. For us, like both the other speakers have mentioned, it's we would be very reluctant. We cannot put any proprietary information out into AI or out in the world at all. We cannot
Yeah.
do that. We have I think it's important to formulate guidelines around the use of AI, and I think that's not even optional for any operation. Doesn't matter what your line of business is. I think you have to have very strict guidelines. I think to the same extent, you want to make sure your resources are properly trained as to how to utilize your AI in terms of the result is that you are wishing to to get from AI. The prompts obviously is very heavily prompt driven. So if people don't get the right training, you may get inconsistent results. I'm 100% with Amy for modeling and things like that. We tend to be reliant on humans, and every deal has got its own nuances. I think it would be hard to get comfortable with an analysis or modeling that's completely AI reliant without human input. Now, existing data that's our data that we feed into AI, like Amy said, to provide an abstract, that is huge. Our own counsel, we don't have in-house counsel. We utilize different, pretty large legal firms across the country, but they all rely on AI as well, as do we for interpretation of legal documents, abstracts, things like that. It saves me personally hours a day. And I think from a risk perspective, it's pretty good too, because, you can look at it from different angles, but it's not just, I think, a subjective interpretation of data. You could, with the right prompting, again, you can get pretty solid feedback of the data that you've given it, in a way that you could very easily, concisely process it, and you get to the finish line a lot quicker. And so that is important for us to really just be more efficient as opposed to letting AI interpret things for us.
I think we
Yeah.
also have to expand our definition of risk. When it comes to incorporating AI into our organizations, it absolutely expands our area of risk. So really looking at that enterprise level oversight that we have, what's the operational exposure, what's the financial exposure, the compliance exposure, all of that has to be taken into consideration.
It's a good point, Amy. We actually had to, incorporate additional scope to our third parties to now, encompass the use of AI. Our IT specialists had to provide us with protocols and protection, et cetera, in terms of the use. Our, fund accountants have certain guardrails. Every division have certain guardrails and, additional scope to their work added because of AI. So although it's a help, it also creates a little bit of additional work, but that's how it goes.
And it goes back to Josh, your point initially, right, about thinking about the investment versus the cost and sort of the, how and where it all works at. We've got a few minutes left here, so I think I'd like to sort of go in this direction. I think as we sort of try to tie this all together, right? I think I'd love to sort of think a little bit about what distinguishes sort of integrated office of the CFO, sort of a modeled one that integrates all these technologies that embraces personnel from one that was maybe even different 5 years ago. So a little bit about kind of how things have evolved over time and how you guys sort of think about things going forward. And Josh, maybe we start with you here. Including AI, not, you could do a whole, I think, webinar on the ways AI has changed things in the last 5 years, right? But thinking about how your office and your role has changed and, since, 2021, 2022, right? How has that sort of changed, and any place you see it going in the next few years?
Well, I'll even go back further than, to than 21, 22 pre-COVID. I think, 10 years ago, you were working on the accounting side, you were working in very sort of simple accounting systems. When I say simple, like just no graphics, right? Very much like, general ledger. Here's, you're making your journal entries. It was a system that only accountants could use, right? To today, where you look at a lot of the leading software, especially in the real estate space, like a Yardi or an MRI, right? Which now do a lot more, right? Than just, even the sort of the basic general ledger is a lot more user-friendly for non-accountants. And there's always been this huge divide about how accountants look at numbers and how non-accountants look at numbers, right? And it's almost like two different languages. And when you're trying to take the backwards looking data, right, which is the accountant's world, and the forward looking data, which is the non-accountant's world, and marry the two, it's like, okay, you've got English and Chinese, right? And that bridge, there's not a lot of bilingual people who
Sure.
understand that. The technology is changing to help reduce that, make that bridge better, right?
Mhm.
And I think that is a continued area where you're going to see improvement. And so through the technologies and also through people being able to understand and spending more time, we've always had in our company, the asset managers, again, speak one language and the accountants speak another. Now we're focused with the tools on being able to train them so they can speak to each other. And there's less lost in translation, right? And I think that's where you're seeing a future go, where
Sure.
very complex concepts are now more easily easily understood by both parties, right? I'm trying to train our accountants to think beyond just backward looking numbers. And we're also trying to train our asset managers to think more like an accountant, right? And help to bridge that gap. So I think that's a big area of, where, like from an accounting perspective, and I'm sure
Sure.
there are other areas that you're seeing change today.
Yeah, absolutely. Amy, what about you? How have things changed for you in the last couple of years? Where do you see things going? Do you find that there's a bridge being built? Do we have a lot to look forward to in that department?
I think so. One of the things that has been always very important in the organizations that I've worked with over the last 10 years have has been that integrated CFO role into the operations, that being able to look upstream, being able to look at operational workflows, look at the ROI. How do we capture data? How are we making, time is money, right? So speed and efficiency. How do we make information digestible across a larger group of people who need to understand both from both sides of that equation, right? The accounting mind and the operational mind are often, like Josh said, they're not speaking the same language. They're coming at the same problem, but they're coming at it from two very different positions. So being
Mhm.
able to have that coalescing between having someone who is bilingual and can bring the two sides together, because nothing about society is slowing down. Everything is advancing at technology is just moving at speeds that we as human beings cannot keep up with. So our operational environments have to be able to, shift and look at, not only process design, but how we're looking at automation and how do we get to root issues faster and be able to come to solutions and just really move organizations forward, because it is our not only our competitors but our clients are able to move at a speed that they were not able to 5 years ago. And it's so important that you're able to automate what you can in order to get those inputs and that output turnaround in as safe of a time as possible. Because if you go too fast and you cut corners and you miss things and you rely too heavily on things that you don't really understand, then that's a whole different set of problems. But I think that integrated role between a CFO and an accounting team and the operations side of any business is becoming more and more unified.
I'll say
Absolutely.
that I had a asset manager here who will remain nameless, who told me once he would never use Yardi come to me and ask me for access to Yardi so he can pull rent rolls himself.
Wow. Well,
So it's
progress, right?
progress,
Sign of the
right?
times.
Right. Absolutely. We've got to go from, you know, this whole thing is also about becoming more proactive versus just reactive, because a lot of what has been happening trying to move into these spaces have been reactive. So the more we can all speak the same language, the better we're going to be at being proactive about developing the solutions that are needed.
Absolutely. And Eloise, why don't we close with you here? So thinking about the next few years based on what everyone is saying, are there capabilities or investments or you think things that organizations should start prioritizing now that will pay dividends in the next few years? Have you guys made any specific, choices on where to sort of lean in your direction as you think about, the risk and reward ratio going forward?
Yeah, I think we will, as I said a few times, I think we will continue to focus on, while we may have to have different platforms across different divisions, we will continue to look at ways to integrate them. And I will say that's probably the one thing that I saw the most advances in over recent years is access and user-friendly data and data availability. And that makes me the most excited about our business. But I think it holds true for a lot of, or many businesses. It's great to be good at your business and to be able to do good business, but not everybody is always close to accounting or speak the language, right? Or are bilingual. But if you start understanding that data and you have access to it while you are doing business, it just makes you so much more nimble. By definition, we have to be creative. Our capital is a little expensive, not a lot, but a little. And but we offer solutions to our clients, and that needs our capital. But we also have risk. And the more you understand the information, the more you understand the data, the more you have access to the data, including the accounting and all of these different aspects of it. I think the more you can manage risk proactively and the closer you are to your own business. And it really makes me excited for how we will do business in the future, because I think that gives you the ability to truly understand how you are operating,
Mhm.
because it's hard to know that you're even doing good business if your accounts are not healthy, right? And the guys that do the business just in reality is not always that close to it at all. So I think that is definitely something I would like to see more focus and investment in, and I think we will. I am seeing some platforms and organizations, software organizations that we've been in discussion with over recent years, just came so far in terms of the research and development they have done in their own systems. Yardi, a good example. There's a few others too. And that means we're not the only ones with that desire to see that. I think the broader market has recognized that. And, you can no longer just sit in one chair and wear one hat. I just think those days no longer exist. That's a very, I think, dated approach of doing business. And all of these technologies and different ways of doing business will make us more efficient and, drive down costs, which is important to your bottom line in the end of the day.
Absolutely. Lot to think about and a lot to look forward to. I think we should wrap it up there. I can't think of a better way to end it. Thank you all so much for being a part of this fantastic conversation. When we were thinking about this and putting this together, I think we really wanted to think about a lot of as we said earlier, a lot of the decisions on how they're made behind the scenes and think about what goes into informing and advancing and thinking about all the commercial opportunity that your firms create and generate in your own way. And hearing this side of the conversation, I think has been incredibly compelling, and I think many folks would agree. So I want to thank you guys for your time. I want to thank Agora, our presenting sponsor on this, for helping make conversations like this possible. And I want to thank everybody who stuck around and tuned in for the conversation. If you missed any of it or you had to leave early or something, don't worry. We'll email the replay around to all you guys afterwards. Thanks again so much for joining us. My name is Will Follett for BizNow. Have a great day. Thank you all.